I sold your house, man. Be grateful I even paid for your week at the roadside motel. His own son left his elderly father to freeze by the side of the road, taking his home. Julian celebrated his victory, despising his father for his poverty. But Arthur didn't break. Having bought the dilapidated train depot, the laughingstock of all developers, at auction for next to nothing, he crawled into the dark underground. What the old man pulled out of the centuries-old dust beneath the rotted beams would forever destroy his son's false empire and transform the abandoned ruins into a national treasure. I sat on the sticky vinyl chair in room 14 of the Highway Inn. The cold November wind battered the cloudy window pane. My son, Julian, departed 30 minutes prior. He left me alone with the suffocating stench of cheap bleach and stagnant dust. On the worn linoleum rested my old fiber suitcase, its iron corners rusted. My fingers traced the cold latch. Corroded metal flaked off, leaving a brown stain on my thumb. Inside lay only my grandfather's brass telegraph key and an old pocket timepiece with cracked glass. My entire past fit inside this gray case. It smelled of dry mastic, dusty leather, and the heavy silence of an autumn evening. Morning arrived. I retrieved a crumpled copy of the Greenfield Gazette from the lobby wastebasket. The cheap newsprint left dark smudges of ink on my dry fingers. In the municipal announcements section, a black column caught my eye. Tax foreclosure sale. My attention locked onto Lot 72. The printed letters read, Blackwood Depot, vacant wooden structure, starting bid $10. An abandoned railroad station. My remaining $15 rustled inside my pocket. A quiet, stubborn desire sparked in my chest. I needed a final refuge, a place secure from Julian's reach, far from the life he stole. The county administration hall reeked of stale paper and cheap tobacco. No one paid attention to the old man clutching a fiber suitcase. When the auctioneer called out Lot 72, Blackwood Depot, the crowded room grew quiet. Local developers smirked with disgust. I raised my trembling hand, clamping a worn $10 bill between my fingers. $10, my voice rasped. A wave of mocking laughter rippled through the hall. Young investors in expensive jackets nudged each other, tapping their temples. They joked about an old man buying a tomb of rotten wood. My eyes remained fixed on the podium, ignoring the sneers. This station belonged to me now. Sean, my old friend, dropped me off by the rusty tracks, buried under a carpet of damp oak leaves. The surrounding forest hummed with ancient pines. Blackwood Depot greeted its new owner with the dark cavities of empty windows. I walked up to the heavy pine door, its gray paint peeling in long strips. Moisture had seized the padlock. I wedged a crowbar into the shackle and pried with my weight. The metal snapped with a sharp crack, releasing a scent of old iron and damp earth. The door creaked open. I stepped into the cold waiting room, greeted by the smell of moss, coal dust, and stagnant history. Night descended fast, bringing a freezing fog. I sat on an overturned wooden crate, wrapping a threadbare wool blanket tight around my shoulders. Every breath escaped as a cloud of white steam. My fingers stiffened, struggling to hold a match. The damp matchbox resisted. On the third strike, a sulfur flame sparked, momentarily illuminating gray walls and thick cobwebs. My muscles ached from the bitter cold. Thoughts of Julian's betrayal kept returning. Under the howling wind, I drifted off to sleep on a bed of pine boughs, pulling my old winter coat over my chest. It retained a faint scent of my lost home. Dawn exposed the true scale of the decay. Weak sunlight forced its way through the cracked shutters. I stood up, fighting the stiffness in my spine, and gathered a broom of pine branches. My sweeping stirred up a thick cloud of gray dust, coating my hair and clothes. I worked my way toward the center of the room, where a massive oak telegraph desk stood. My hand touched the blackened wood. Soot and hardened grime coated the surface. I took a piece of sandpaper and began rubbing the grain, inhaling the bitter scent of old oak and the machine oil of a forgotten era. Step by step, I tested the floorboards around the desk. The pine planks groaned under my weight. Directly beneath the heavy legs of the telegraph terminal, the wood yielded, proving soft and springy. I knelt, ignoring the sharp protest in my joints. The splintered wood scratched my palms. I rapped my knuckles against the dark plank. A hollow, empty echo returned. Decades of dirt packed the deep crevices. Someone had either neglected the rotten joists or purposefully created a hidden cavity beneath this floor, concealing it from the world under a layer of grime. I gripped the cold steel handle of the crowbar. My sweaty palms slipped against the metal. I wedged the tool into the narrow gap between the wide pine planks. Leaning my entire weight into the lever, I pulled, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The wood splintered with a sharp, agonizing groan. Red rust and dry wood chips showered the floor, releasing a scent of pine resin and ancient earth. The board gave way, flying aside. From the exposed black void below, a freezing draft rushed out, carrying the distinct aroma of old wool, beeswax, and ancient paper. I reached into the dark opening. My fingers brushed against a hard surface, thick with sticky cobwebs and cold dust. I gripped the heavy object, pulling it upward with an effort straining my shoulders. A heavy brass box with massive rivets emerged into the light. Green tarnish coated the ice-cold metal. On the lid, my thumb traced an engraving of crossed signal flags and the letters U.S.M. My heart hammered against my ribs. This discarded railroad station held a secret, preserved for generations within its dark, silent walls. I placed the heavy brass chest onto the newly sanded oak desk. My thumb pressed the stiff brass latch. The mechanism yielded with a sharp metallic click. The lid lifted, the hinges screeching with ancient rust. A concentrated scent of time escaped, a mixture of dry book paper, paraffin, old ink, and faded lavender. Inside lay neat stacks of documents tied with rough hemp twine. The paper had yellowed, brittle as autumn leaves. I carefully untied the knot, my fingers coating in a fine gray powder of undisturbed dust. These letters carried voices from a forgotten past. I unfolded the first crisp sheet. The paper had the texture of thin, dry suede. The black ink, written in elegant calligraphy, had faded to a dusty blue-gray. At the top of the page sat a clear date, October 14, 1862. The handwritten lines flowed before me. Dispatch completed successfully. 5 souls secured in the dry cellar until the arrival of the night train. A chill rippled across my skin. These voices of the past spoke directly to me in the silence of the room. I held the real, forgotten history of a struggle for human dignity. At the bottom of the chest rested a thick parchment scroll. It smelled of beeswax and old leather. A red silk ribbon secured the document, weighted down by a heavy wax seal bearing the emblem of an eagle. I carefully unrolled the page, my fingertips tracing the deep indentations of a steel pen. The elegant script named Thomas Vance, my maternal ancestor, appointed as the depot's first station master. This was an official 1862 land patent, granting permanent ownership of the station and the surrounding forest. My $15 purchase at the auction concealed a massive, undeniable claim to the entire valley, a reality previously obscured from the county. The roar of a powerful engine shattered the quiet of the forest. Julian's expensive black SUV came to a halt behind the decaying platform of Blackwood Depot. My son entered without knocking. He shielded his nose with a costly silk handkerchief, protecting himself from the dampness, mold, and disturbed dust. The leather soles of his shoes crushed the pine shavings scattered across the floor with a dry, sharp crunch. Julian threw a stack of glossy eviction documents onto my newly sanded oak desk. He demanded my immediate departure. His elite golf club required this land for expansion. My son sneered, kicking an old iron umbrella stand near the door. The heavy metal object rolled across the dirty, creaking floorboards, its ringing echo filling the empty hall, a space still retaining the quiet memory of a bygone era. I stood up slowly, my fingers tightly gripping the cold brass casing of my grandfather's pocket timepiece. The ribbed edge of the instrument pressed into my calloused skin, anchoring my resolve. I faced Julian directly, my eyes locked onto his cold face, betraying no hint of fear. My voice sounded remarkably steady under the high rafters of the old depot. "This station belongs to me by law," I spoke quietly, letting the words hang in the damp air. I deliberately slid his glossy papers off the desk, letting them fall into a pile of sawdust. My actions confirmed my resolve, solid as these thick timber walls. Old Sean arrived at twilight, carrying a heavy, blackened tin kettle and a box of hand tools. The fragrance of hot pine tar tea quickly pushed the damp chill out of the main room. We sat at the oak table, illuminated by the low flame of my kerosene lamp. Sean took the fragile 1862 land patent, smoothing the curled edges with his rough, calloused fingers. "Julian is relentless, Arthur," Sean murmured, his eyes studying the red wax seal. "You must search the original land registries in the Greenfield County Courthouse." Sean offered his rattling truck for our journey. We agreed to depart at dawn, pursuing a hidden truth buried under decades of municipal dust. The Greenfield County Courthouse greeted us with massive granite columns and the heavy scent of floor wax. Down in the basement, where the municipal archive lay, a profound silence reigned. Towering oak cabinets reached the ceiling, packed with massive leather-bound ledgers. I ran my hand along the spine of an 1860 volume. A thick layer of gray dust coated my fingertips, smelling of dried leather and old animal glue. The archivist, a silver-haired gentleman named Mr. Norris, inspected my old land patent through thick spectacles. He offered a silent nod, pointing toward a heavy wooden table in the corner, granting me access to the past. I hauled the massive land registry ledger for the years 1862 to 1868 across the table. The cracked leather binding groaned as I opened the cover. A sharp, slightly sour smell of decaying paper and vinegar drifted upward. I carefully turned the thick, rough pages, my fingertips gathering a fine yellow powder of paper dust. Intricate ink strokes recorded the boundaries of forgotten estates and timber leases. My eyes scanned the flowing script, tracing the lines until I reached the records of the Boston-Vermont Railway line, the exact section containing my depot. My hand paused at page 44. The right-hand sheet, designated for the 1864 records, appeared blank. However, the parchment felt noticeably thinner and rougher there. Someone had carefully scraped the ink away with a razor blade. I tilted my head, catching the angled light from the cellar window. Faint, microscopic indentations from a steel pen emerged. The dust of decades failed to conceal the truth. I traced the shallow grooves with my index finger, identifying the ghosts of words someone had tried to erase from the history of Greenfield. I pulled a soft graphite pencil from my coat pocket. Holding the lead flat against the page, I shaded the scraped parchment with light, circular strokes. Fine gray dust settled into the indentations. Out of the graphite shadow, clear letters emerged. The text read, "Exclusive right of long-term lease of forest land." The floorboards groaned beneath my feet as the hidden words took shape. I turned the page, discovering a glued transfer document dated 1890, bearing the official seal of Greenfield. I inspected the signature of Mayor Thomas Cole. The ink had a strange purple tint, contrasting with the deep, iron gall ink of the surrounding text. I touched the old red wax seal. The dry wax crumbled under my fingernail, turning to fine red dust on the desk. The signature was a clumsy imitation, executed years after the recorded date. Someone had forged the document to authorize the illegal seizure of the forest lands bordering the railway. I retrieved the folded Civil War map from my brass box. Spreading it over the 1920 county registry map, I observed how the old hand-drawn lines aligned with the modern geography. My finger traced the riverbank and the old timber boundaries. Mr. Norris, observing my work from his desk, silently approached and adjusted the green-shaded lamp, casting a bright yellow circle over our hands. Under the light, Julian's golf club properties clearly encroached upon the protected forest preserve belonging to my station. On a yellowed page of the ledger, I located a specific covenant regarding the 150-year conditional lease of the timberlands, dated June 1864. The faded ink stated that the structures on this territory remained the property of the lessees solely if the boundaries of the forest preserve and the railway depot remained intact. Any violation of these terms resulted in the immediate, unconditional reversion of the complete structures and surrounding land to the legal owner of Blackwood Depot. My fingers trembled as I read the words. The smell of the ancient paper carried the promise of justice. The pieces of the puzzle aligned in my mind. Julian had built his entire luxury golf club on the protected forest land, violating the boundaries and destroying the old pines. Because of this boundary breach, the entire club property legally belonged to me, under the terms of the 1864 covenant. I closed the massive ledger with a heavy thud, sending a small cloud of paper dust into the air. I stood up from my creaking chair, my spine straightening. I was no longer an unwanted exile. I was the legal master of the entire forest estate. I packed my notes and map copies into my old fiber suitcase. The metal latches closed with a familiar, dry click, puffing a tiny cloud of dust from the worn lid. I nodded to the quiet archivist, Mr. Norris, and walked out of the basement. Every stone step of the courthouse stairs echoed with a sense of triumph. Outside, Sean waited in his idling truck. The smell of gasoline and fresh autumn wind swept away the musty odor of the archives. I sat in the passenger seat, holding the suitcase tight, ready to reclaim my name. The heavy timber door of Blackwood Depot opened with a familiar, prolonged screech. On the threshold stood Dr. Evelyn Hart, a renowned historian from Boston University. A chilly autumn wind rushed in behind her, sweeping dry leaves and gray paper dust off the floor. Evelyn breathed in the dense air, a mixture of old oak, kerosene, and ancient parchment. She carefully placed her leather briefcase on the restored telegraph desk. I silently offered her the tarnished brass latch of the old chest. Evelyn touched the cold metal with a researcher's deep reverence, recognizing a key to the undiscovered secrets of New England. Evelyn retrieved a magnifying glass in a brass frame from her briefcase, carefully spreading the yellowed letters of 1862 across the wood. The dry paper rustled under her slender fingers. Each touch raised a faint gray haze, smelling of beeswax and dried lavender. Through her lens, she closely examined the fibrous structure of the paper and the depth of the steel pen's indentations. "This ink represents authentic 19th century iron gall composition," Evelyn whispered, her face shining with excitement. She gently traced the raised wax seal of Thomas Vance, confirming the authenticity of this historical testament to human liberty. We worked deep into the night. I moved the old brass kerosene lamp closer, its base clinking against the oak table. In the uneven yellow light, specks of dust danced. Evelyn compared the courthouse registry copies with the 1862 patent. The old floorboards groaned under our movements, seeming to approve of our persistent labor. I traced the faded ink boundaries of the map with my dry finger, marking the coordinates of ancient oaks and granite boundary stones. A sharp smell of burning kerosene mingled with the scent of ancient paper. On a large sheet of drafting paper, a seamless, legally bulletproof chain of title emerged. Late at night, Evelyn reclined in the old wooden chair, the joinery groaning under her weight. Her face radiated triumph. "Arthur, we have the complete proof," she whispered, resting her hand on the stack of reconstructed documents. "The state court will accept this patent without question. We won." A heavy weight lifted from my soul. I retrieved my grandfather's pocket timepiece, running a thumb over the cool brass casing before winding the mechanism. The steady, comforting tick of the gears filled the silent depot, bringing a long-awaited hope of justice. Sharp headlights suddenly cut through the dusty windows of Blackwood Depot, throwing long, trembling shadows across the walls. Outside, the screech of brakes signaled the arrival of several vehicles, followed by the heavy thud of closing doors. I shuddered, my fingers clamping onto the edge of the desk. Rough voices broke the night. Potted boots marched across the rotting wood of the platform. The depot door flew open with a splintering crash. Cold night air rushed in, extinguishing the lamp and raising plumes of gray dust under the glare of tactical flashlights. Julian stepped into the room, followed by a broad man in uniform, the corrupt Sheriff Miller. A heavy leather holster squeaked at his hip with every stride. The floorboards groaned under the weight of the men. Julian held a document bearing a red seal. "A summary demolition order," Julian spoke flatly, tossing the paper onto our work. I moved to shield the documents. Sheriff Miller shoved me aside, sending me stumbling. My elbow struck the cast-iron rim of the stove. The scent of Julian's expensive cologne mingled with the smell of disturbed soot, filling the room with a hostile, suffocating atmosphere. Two of the sheriff's deputies began a brutal search, turning over old crates and splintering the pine partitions. Sharp cracks of fracturing wood filled the room. Evelyn Hart raised her phone to record the destruction. One of the deputies lunged, wrenching the device from her fingers and smashing it on the floor. Old ledger books flew from the shelves, their yellowed pages tearing with a dry paper cry. A dense cloud of ancient dust forced us to cough. I stood by, unable to prevent the destruction of my work, under the muddy boots of Julian's hired men. Suddenly, Julian let out a triumphant shout. At the bottom of a deep cabinet, his eyes caught the heavy brass chest. My son seized it with greedy hands, weighing the metal. "Here it is!" Julian cried, his face twisted in satisfaction. The green copper tarnish rubbed off on his clean fingers, but he paid no attention to the stains. He pried open the lid, the rusted hinges screeching. Inside lay a stack of yellowed documents tied with twine. Julian clutched the chest to his chest like a prize, convinced he held the original papers, capable of destroying his career. Stepping onto the platform, Julian threw the stack of papers into a burning iron barrel where the workers destroyed construction debris. The flames hungrily consumed the dry sheets. The paper curled and blackened in the heat, sending dark flakes of ash into the night sky. I ran outside. Sheriff Miller gripped my shoulders, his fingers pinching my aching joints. The smell of burning paper, scorched wax, and pine smoke filled the damp air. Julian tracked the fire with a cold, victorious smile, confident he had erased the danger of his financial ruin. Sheriff Miller shoved me down, sending me tumbling onto the wet grass at the foot of the platform. Silt and cold water instantly soaked the sleeves of my old coat. My knees throbbed from the impact against the gravel. My old fiber suitcase landed beside me, its lid popping open to reveal my grandfather's telegraph tools. I lay there, my face pressed into the damp leaves, inhaling the scent of decaying vegetation and defeat. Rain began to beat against my shoulders. I was completely helpless, discarded like the ancient dust, swept out of my quiet sanctuary. Out of the dark forest, two heavy yellow bulldozers crawled forward, their exhausts coughing dark smoke. Their metal tracks ground against the rusty rails, crushing the rotted wooden ties. The damp earth vibrated beneath my body. The steel blades gleamed under the headlights. Workers began stretching yellow caution tape around Blackwood Depot. I understood. In a few hours, only a pile of splinters would remain of my home. Julian stood on the platform, leaning against the railing, shouting orders to begin the complete destruction of my heritage. Evelyn Hart wept silently beside me on the wet grass, her clothes smeared with mud, her hair soaked by the rain. Her eyes tracked the glowing embers in the iron barrel, where the ashes of our work lay. I reached out, closing the lid of my fiber suitcase. The latches clicked shut, marking the end of my struggle. The timepiece in my pocket had grown silent, its mainspring snapped by the violence of my fall. Heavy steel machines loomed over my last refuge. The lie had triumphed. The truth was reduced to gray ash. Applause thundered inside the crystal-lit banquet hall of the elite Greenfield Country Club. Julian stood proud at the podium, celebrating his victory and the imminent expansion of his golf courses. Waiters navigated the crowd, offering champagne and crystal flutes. The clink of glass mingled with the loud laughter of wealthy investors. My son wore an impeccable, expensive suit, his face glowing with self-satisfaction. He believed his actions had erased the stain of his father's station. The fragrance of fine alcohol, rich food, and fresh lilies filled the vast room, creating an illusion of permanent triumph. Julian raised his glass, confident his future remained secure, while his father remained buried in the past. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the banquet hall split open with a sharp, dry crash. I stood on the threshold, wearing my old, carefully brushed gray coat. Beside me stood Dr. Evelyn Hart and a stern man in a dark suit, Federal Marshal Davis. The guests fell silent. My muddy boots left wet tracks on the highly polished wood floor. In my hands, I held a darkened pine pencil case designed for telegraph tape, smelling of machine oil and dry wood. I walked toward the podium with slow, heavy strides, disrupting the artificial warmth of the room. Julian let out a smug laugh, stepping forward to block my path. "You came uninvited, Father," he spoke loudly, ensuring the entire room heard his voice. "And you have nothing. Your old papers burned yesterday night. I observed the ashes myself." Several investors snickered, supporting their host. Julian adjusted the gold cufflinks on his shirt. He stood completely certain his cover-up had succeeded. I observed him in silence, my steady, quiet posture causing him to hesitate. His triumphant smile slowly slid from his pale face, exposing a sudden, rising panic. "You always underestimated the precision of the telegraph, Julian," I spoke softly, placing the wooden case on the polished table. The sound of wood on wood echoed in the silent hall. The brass chest contained only replicas, printed on Evelyn's archival paper. I unlatched the case. Inside, wrapped in thick oilcloth, lay the authentic 1862 land patent and the missing pages of the ledger. The rich aroma of pine resin, tar, and ancient ink filled the air. I had hidden the originals inside the hollow cast-iron base of the old telegraph machine, transported to Sean's workshop for repair. Federal Marshal Davis stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase and retrieving an official document bearing the heavy gold seal of the Department of Justice. The thick paper rustled in his hands. "Julian Vance, by order of the federal court, a permanent injunction is placed on the entire property of your club," Davis announced. "The original 1862 patent is recognized as authentic. Your transactions are voided." A heavy silence descended on the room. Only the sound of rain drummed against the windows. Julian's investors began whispering, realizing their millions had turned to dust. The champagne glass in Julian's hand trembled, slipping from his fingers and shattering on the polished floor. The liquid pooled among the glittering shards. His face turned pale. He stared at the original blueprints in my hands, understanding his career, influence, and wealth were destroyed by this single yellowed paper, smelling of old tar. His partners began to step away, picking up their folders and refusing to deal with a fraud who had ruined his own father. Losing his composure, Julian dropped to his knees in the spilled alcohol, his expensive trousers soaking in the mess. His manicured hands gripped the rough, coarse wool of my old coat. "Father, spare me," he pleaded, his voice shaking with terror. "Sign the waiver. I'll return the house. I'll give you money." The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the cold sweat of fear. I firmly but gently removed his fingers from my sleeve, finding only the emptiness of his fake remorse. I retrieved my grandfather's gold-nibbed fountain pen from the wooden case, unscrewing the cap smelling of old ink. Under the eyes of the investors and the press, I placed the official deed before the notary. The scratch of the pen on the thick paper sounded like a final sentence. I signed, transferring the entire land under the club to the National Park Service and the Greenfield Historical Society. The ancient forest was saved from destruction. Julian hid his face in his hands, ruined. I closed the wooden case, snapping the brass latch and raising a tiny puff of dust. I turned and walked toward the exit. Evelyn and Sean walked beside me, our steps echoing in the empty hall. The cool night air, smelling of pine needles and clean rain, greeted us at the door. I breathed deeply, the heavy tension leaving my chest. The club was left behind, a monument to greed. I walked to Sean's truck, holding the case close to my heart. Sean's truck stopped at the platform of Blackwood Depot. Julian's bulldozers were gone by order of the marshal, leaving deep tracks in the wet clay. The rain stopped. A silver moon shone through the clouds. I entered the quiet station. The floorboards creaked in welcome. The smell of pine resin, old coal, and ancient parchment filled my lungs. The station stood. It was the officially recognized heart of the forest preserve, holding pure truth. I sat by the warm cast-iron stove, pine logs crackling. The smell of resin smoke wrapped the room in comfort. I took out my grandfather's pocket timepiece, wiping the dirt and dust from its brass case. I carefully pressed the snapped spring with a finger, peering at the tiny gears. The balance wheel began to swing. A steady, clean tick-tock filled the depot. Time resumed its course. The timepiece survived, like me. Sean and Evelyn drank tea from tin mugs at the oak table. The room smelled of forest herbs and pine resin. My eyes traced the dark pines under the starry New England sky through the clean glass. A wave of bittersweet sadness washed over me. I lost a son but reclaimed my dignity, ancestry, and peace. Justice won through quiet truth. I smiled, content in the harbor of my home, surrounded by true friends who will never leave me.